Masculinity and Violence. He explores how masculine ideas shape and influence patterns of violence in the local context, and his work seeks to contribute to valuable insights to the broader discourse on gender, violence, and societal structures. I'm going to hand over to him to get us going. And just as a reminder to those at home as well, we will have the talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will just open up in the remaining 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A. So take it away, Bapiwe.
Can I use that corner?
Yeah, go for it.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for having me at today's seminar. Like Shino was saying earlier, my name is Bapiwe Gobodo. I'm a postdoc student at the Center for the Afterlife of Violence here at Stellenbosch University. I did my master's here at Stellenbosch as well, my master's and my PhD. But I originally come from the Eastern Cape, which is where my research focus or interests kind of developed. This is actually a presentation of my full PhD thesis. So cutting it out and finding the right things to present is very difficult. And especially at this time where I've already started drawing up articles and stuff like that, it's very difficult to figure out what's important for people to present. So for today's presentation, I figured what I will try to do with the time given to us is I will try to take you through an introduction, and because I'm in sociology, give you more for a background of my theoretical framework, how I came to get my data, and then I'm going to skip my research methodology because of time, but I'm hoping that at the end of my talk, I'll still have a bit more time to go into that a bit, because I do know that people generally always have questions about that as well. Yeah, so I think I'll go straight into it, and then, but I was going to say that I think something that's interesting when I start talking about my work is to, again, the background of why I was interested in this work. I did my master's looking at the initiation processes that young Black men go through in boys' high schools. So that's hazing practices in boys' high schools, and making a link between the violence, the systemized violence that happens at these boys' schools, and how it becomes normalized and taught through different like sports and et cetera. And during this time, I had a cousin who had recently passed away, who had also been stabbed in an altercation at home back home in Eastern Cape. And my questions around his death, because it was so untimely, and especially for, you'll hear in my work, because I also go into the idea of foster initiation. So this becomes important, the idea of having older brothers, older cousins that are there to support you, and having had an important figure such as that passed away in that way, for me was kind of not traumatizing, but it was very impactful, because again, he was this older brother figure to me. And it kind of made me question, because the young man that had stabbed him was also someone that we grew up with, someone we knew from the area. So this idea of what exactly it is that pushes us so further into violence, and especially then into a point where you murder someone that you grew up with, someone that you know. So this kind of intricate relationship between what exactly violence means for young men. Why does this become such a language that we seem to respond to and we start to negotiate in? So like I said, I'll be going through my introduction, and then as I go through my introduction, I'll go into my theoretical framework as well. So South Africa continues to grapple with the persistently high levels of interpersonal violence, with young men disproportionately represented both as perpetrators and as victims. Within public discourse, policy debates, and even strands of academic scholarship, this statistical reality has frequently hardened into a familiar narrative, which is young Black men are cast primarily as dangerous, hypermasculine subjects whose relationship to violence is assumed to be self-evident. Such framings, however, obscure the complexity of young men's lived experiences, particularly in historically marginalized township spaces, where violence is not an abstract social problem, but an everyday condition shaping identity, aspiration, and belonging. This paper draws on my doctoral research with 10 young Black men from the Langa township in the Western Cape, who have been targets of violence. Rather than approaching these men through the dominant lens of deviance of pathology, the study foregrounds their own meaning-making experiences. It asks how experiences of being targets of violence shape their understanding of masculinity, how they navigate the paradox of being positioned simultaneously as potential perpetrators and vulnerable subjects, and how they negotiate masculine status within a context marked by racial, spatial inequality, and enduring socio-economic precarity. Langa, which is one of the oldest Black townships in Cape Town, remains deeply structured by the legacies of colonialism and apartheid spatial planning. Designed initially to house immigrant laborers, it has been a site where race, class, and gender intersect to produce constrained life chances. In the post-apartheid period, while formal racial segregation has ended, material inequalities, unemployment, overcrowding, and high levels of crime continue to shape everyday life. Within such conditions, violence becomes a living threat and a social language through which power, respect, and belonging are negotiated. For young men in particular, masculinity is forged within this terrain of risk and expectation. Masculinity studies have long argued that gender is not a fixed attribute, but a social practice, produced and reproduced through everyday interactions. Yet in the South African context, scholarship has been concentrated on men's violence against women or on gang-related criminality, reinforcing an image of young Black men as primarily agents of harm. While this body of work is crucial, it has left comparatively unexplored the experiences of young men as targets of violence, and the ways in which such experiences complicate dominant understandings of hegemonic masculinity. By centering the experiences of young Black men who have been targets of violence, this study disrupts the static binary of perpetrator and victim, and instead examines how young men occupy both these positions in their lifetimes. Theoretically, this paper is grounded in an intersectional framework and in scholarship on masculinities. Intersectionality enables an analysis attentive to how race, class, space, and even age converge to shape the vulnerability and agency of young Black men who live in the Langa township. Masculinity theory, particularly debates around hegemonic masculinity, provides tools for understanding how violence may operate how violence may operate as one among several practices through which masculine status is asserted, contested, or resisted. At the same time, this study is cautious not to reduce Black masculinities to aspirational forms of white patriarchal dominance. Instead, it treats masculinity as historically and spatially situated, shaped by the specific conditions of township life and by the enduring racialization of Black male bodies as threatening. Importantly, the young men in the study do not narrate themselves solely through injury or grievance. Alongside accounts of assault, robbery, and interpersonal conflict are stories of restraint, reflection, and healing. Some participants described rejecting retaliatory violence, reimagining fatherhood as a site of responsibility, or even pursuing educational or occupational aspirations that reconfigure what it means to be respected as a man in the township. These narratives illuminate alternative masculinities that coexist with and at times challenge dominant scripts of toughness and risk-taking. By listening closely to the voices of young Black men who have been targets of violence, this article contributes to a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between masculinities and violence in South Africa. It argues that violence should not be read solely as an expression of male dominance, but also as a structuring condition that shapes how young men come to understand themselves, their vulnerabilities, and their possibilities for ethical and relational forms of manhood. In doing so, the study seeks to move beyond reductive portrayals of Black men as either pathological perpetrators or passive victims, and instead, it situates the experiences within the intersecting histories of race, space, and inequality that continue to define township life. From a theoretical framework, this study is anchored in three interrelated theoretical orientations, namely hegemonic masculinity, its critical reworking within African-centered scholarship, and intersectionality. Together, these frameworks provide a lens through which to analyze young Black men in Langa, construct, contest, and inhibit masculinities in a context marked by racialized inequality and everyday violence. Rather than treating masculinity as a fixed attribute, this framework approaches it as historically situated, socially reproduced, and shaped by intersecting structures of power. Hegemonic masculinity. The concept of hegemonic masculinity, most prominently developed by Raymond Connell, provides a foundational entry point. Hegemonic masculinity refers to the culturally dominant configuration of masculinity in a given context, one that legitimizes men's collective dominance over women and the subordination of other men. Importantly, it does not describe the lived reality of most men, but rather an idealized standard against which men are measured and hierarchically positioned. Masculinities are thus multiple, relational, and stratified. In the South African context, scholarship has shown that toughness, heterosexual prowess, economic provision, and the capacity for violence often form part of a dominant masculine ideals. Violence in this framing can function as a resource for asserting authority or securing recognition in settings where other forms of capital, such as maybe stable employment, are limited. For young men in township spaces like Langa, where structural unemployment and spatial marginalization constrain access to formal status markers, the performance of toughness may become a visible and immediate means of claiming masculine legitimacy. However, hegemonic masculinity has also been subject to sustained critique. Scholars have argued that the concept risks overgeneralization, analytical vagueness, and an implicit universalization of Western gender categories. When uncritically applied, it can obscure the historical specificity of gender categories. When uncritically applied, it can obscure the historical specificity of Black masculinities and reproduce the assumption that all men aspire to patriarchal dominance. Moreover, in racialized societies such as South Africa, Black men have not historically occupied hegemonic positions within the broader social order. Under colonialism and apartheid, Black masculinity was systematically denied full recognition as manhood, and it was positioned instead as subordinate, infantilized, or hypercriminalized. These critiques are particularly salient for this study of the young men in Langa are located within a post-apartheid context in which racial inequality persists and where Black male bodies are often simultaneously feared and marginalized. To analyze their masculinities solely through the lens of patriarchal dominance would risk flattening the structural conditions that shape their vulnerabilities. Thus, hegemonic masculinity remains analytically useful for understanding internal hierarchies among men and the normative pressure to conform to certain ideals. I argue, though, that it must be situated within broader structural and historical racial framework. And toward an African-centered approaches to masculinity. So in response to these limitations, African-centered scholarship has sought to situate Western gender theory and foreground local understandings of manhood. Scholars such as Robert Morel, Kopano Ratere, and Sankumzi Fekang have argued that masculinities in African context can be analyzed in relation to colonialism, racial capital, and the violent restructuring of African social life. Ratere in particular emphasizes that some men have historically been denied full access to the category of men, and this denial shapes how masculinity is experienced and performed. African-centered approaches thus challenges the assumption that men are always synonymous with power. They highlight how Black men may simultaneously benefit from gender privilege in relation to women while being structurally subordinated by race and class. This dual positioning complicates simplistic narratives of patriarchy and requires attention to context, history, and locality. In township settings, masculinity is shaped not only by gender hierarchies, but also by spatial segregation, as you'll see in this study, economic exclusion, and the lingering effects of apartheid racial ordering. This perspective is particularly important in a study of young Black men who have been targets of violence. Their experiences reveal that masculinity is not merely about domination, but also about vulnerability, survival, and negotiation. The township thus becomes a site where masculine status is both aspired to and precarious, where recognition must be earned with constrained structural and precarious conditions. African-centered scholarship therefore enables a move away from pathologizing accounts of Black masculinity and toward a more historically grounded understanding of how manhood is constructed under conditions of racialized inequality. Fekane, writing on this idea of African-centered approaches to masculinity, argues that human beings are active in constructions of their masculinity. However, this happens in an environment that is made up of more than other individuals, which is ancestral spirits and other evil forces which exist in the social environment that human beings inhabit and inside human beings, and can thus influence the outcomes of human action. This supports my argument that theories of masculinity must include these popular understandings of reality in African settings. To adopt this approach, I have included Uraluko to highlight how undergoing initiation for young Xhosa-speaking men helps to shape their masculinities. Fekane argues that such theories will not only transcend limited conceptions of masculinity as socially constructed and accomplished individually in a social context, but they will also serve as a basis for developing culturally relevant intervention programs. Intersectionality. To account for the multiple experiences shaping these young men's life, this study draws on intersectionality, first articulated by Kimberly Crenshaw. Intersectionality emerged from Black feminist legal theory to address how systems of oppression, particularly race and gender, interact to produce forms of marginalization that cannot be understood through single axis analysis. Crenshaw demonstrated that treating race and gender as separate categories obscures the specific experiences of those located at the intersection. Although initially developed in the United States, intersectionality has been widely adopted and reworked within African studies. In the South African context, it has proven particularly generative for analyzing how race, gender, and class, and even space intersect within a society structured by apartheid's racial capitalism. Intersectional scholarship in Africa emphasizes that identities are not additive, but mutually constitutive. So therefore, being a young Black man in Langa cannot be reduced. Intersectional scholarship in Africa emphasizes that identities are not additive, but mutually constitutive. Thus, being a young Black man in Langa cannot just be reduced to being Black, but also being a male, and thus these two categories intersect. Okay, and this is how the integrative approach. So then I went on to integrate both of these approaches for my findings. So by bringing hegemonic masculinity into dialogue with African-centered critiques and intersectionality, this theoretical framework allows for a nuanced analysis of young Black men's lives in Langa. Hegemonic masculinity helps illuminate internal hierarchies and normative pressures among men. African-centered scholarship situates these dynamics within colonial and apartheid histories that have shaped Black manhood. And intersectionality ensures that race, class, and space remain central to the analysis. Together, these frameworks move the study beyond essentialist portrayals of Black masculinity as inherently violent. They instead position masculinity as socially constructed, historically mediated, and contextually negotiated set of practices. In doing so, the framework provides the conceptual tools necessary to analyze how young Black men who have been targets of violence understand themselves, navigate competing masculine ideas, and imagine alternative forms of manhood within the spatial structural realities of the Langa township. Now for my findings. Like I said earlier on, I will be skipping my theoretical framework to go straight into my findings. So in this chapter, I describe and interpret the research findings to arrive at a clear understanding of the experiences of the participants of the study. The experiences of being targets of violence, as well as the meaning-making and the navigation of the post-apartheid township space. By examining the answers given by my participants in this chapter, I hope to paint a picture that clarifies how they made meaning of the experiences of violence. I draw on and thematically analyze the collective individual responses of participants. In this chapter, I will discuss the relevant findings that emerged from the thematic analysis of the interview data. Excerpts from the participants' talk serve to include the voices of the participants in the analytical discussion and also provide evidence for the presented findings. This chapter recognizes the multifaceted nature of Black men's experiences and interrogates these experiences as a guideline to how power differentiations can inform the construction of multiple unequal masculinities in South Africa. The key themes that this chapter will present are onikurans, ulwaluko, and experiences of violence in specific spaces such as those. Ignorance is a general term used to define a kind of turmoil that occurred between social groups comprised of youth between the different locations in the Cape Town's Black townships. Kuzulwa, who writes about Ignorance phenomena in the context of the Khayelitsha township, which is another township here in the Western Cape, argues that it is generally known that youths who are involved in Ignorance are mainly male secondary school learners, who mostly meet for social interactions on weekdays, especially on Fridays, during school holidays, and during matric dances. She states that they often engage in fight matches between different Ignorance groups or crews, and the activities have been linked with the increase of violence and terror in the townships where they operate. Conflicts could arise during these interactions and evolve into violent escapades. Each unique group of these boys is called a crew. there might be several crews in a singular township, each one defining the boundaries of their territory within the township. Just to have maybe a bit of a better explanation for this ignorance. So what happens is from my understanding of it this started maybe late in the 90s, but as it became more of a phenomenon from my understanding of it, and as it evolved in other townships here in Cape Town, it happened that groups of boys were forming that weren't necessarily identified as gangsters, as these were young boys between maybe the ages of 13 to about 16, 17. And these young boys were participating in what they called or referred to as matches, where boys from a specific school or a specific area. So if we all came from the Langa township and we studied in Cape Town, as we meet up in the taxi ranks or whatever, there'd be fights that break out between the two crews. So this further broke out into the township where they would have matches like during school, like as this one study says, that maybe even after matric dances, students would come to, if your school has the matric dance, today we come into your school and then fights would break out. So this was pretty interesting because a lot of these young boys, first of all, argued that this wasn't necessarily gangsterism in your traditional sense. And as I go on with the findings, you'll find that even when they refer to each other and how some of these crews started, for instance, one of the young men mentioned how he got into a fight with someone and one of the other boys helped him and he eventually ended up joining their crew. So my argument is that these not only serve as gangsterism in the same way that your usual criminal gangsters would, but then they serve as social groups where these young boys were forming crews for safety, some of whom were protecting each other from because of the spaces. So if you were from this side of Stellenbosch, you couldn't enter that side of Stellenbosch. If you were found on that side of Stellenbosch, you'd get stabbed. For instance, one of the young men I interviewed was paralyzed after one of these incidents. So they got really bad and they still continue on and off. But in the Langa township, as some of the young men explained to me, that it took for the community to kind of bind in together. And they have a forum now called the Langa Patrol, where all the men in the township go around the township looking after people's houses if you've broken in, and you go to report to them. A lot of these men being taxi drivers or other respectable men here in the township. So this was on ignorance, sorry. So I was going to grants. So participants identified the period between 2013 and 2018 as the height of ignorance activity in the Langa township, describing it as a time when territorial confrontations among young men became particularly widespread and socially significant. The contention that the ignorance culture has earlier other than the year 2003 is revealed in the work of scholars such as Walsh and Mitchell, who reported about groups of young men who were participating in violent activities in Khayelitsha. Although these writers did not specifically refer to the violent behavioral characteristics of these groups, such as ignorance, they nevertheless likened the problem of the wider gang problem, which had been affecting the city of Cape Town at the time. Youth violence has long been present in Cape Town townships. However, the accounts in this study suggest that ignorance represents a relatively recent form with dynamics that differ from the more established gang structures found in nearby colored areas and from the organized gangs that operated during apartheid, as reported by Pinnock. Rather than functioning as formal gangs, ignorance emerged as a distinct configuration of peer-based conflict, rooted in neighborhood identity, mobility control, and informal territorial boundaries. The below narratives indicate how participants understood the origins of this phenomenon and how territorially shaped its escalation. Most of the participants consistently described ignorance as a place-based retaliatory form of youth violence that crystallized into informal territorial boundaries. For example, one of my participants, Lusanda and Sandiso, for example, explained, it started with one murder. And so then people said that people from a certain area would never enter the site again. So that's how I can say it started. I think I got a big part of ignorance was that people hated each other because of how different our areas were. They weren't necessarily jealous, but it became a thing of people not wanting to be in areas where they're not from. I think this is a township thing, because even if you go to another township and you tell them you're from Langa, they automatically won't like you because you're not from there. Malusi similarly described the escalation of conflict between neighborhoods. How I see it is that, and I've never been involved in those things, but how I see it is that there were people from the location that went to KCP, which is another part of the township, and they didn't get along. And the ones from the Vato, which was one of the established crews, started the argument. and then that ends in people killing each other. And no one wants peace and they want revenge. These accounts suggest that participants understood Ikurans as emerging from interpersonal conflict that expanded into a township-wide territorial order rather than from formal gang structures. These were not isolated incidents, but a pattern system of conflict shaped by local histories, spatial boundaries, and peer recognition. The emergence of territorial divisions transformed everyday mobility, redefined neighborhood relationships, and established an informal geography of threat and belonging that structured young men's lives. The issue of territory is not something new. It has been practiced by many gangs that had existed during and after apartheid, and most prominently in Cape Town colored areas. Gangs use territory markers to limit people's movements. Crews may not be gangs per se, but the youth therein have adopted a notion of neighborhood territory. They walk around their block or neighborhood, hang around in the street corners, and create their own names that align with their social groups and activities. Names such as Amavato, Amavura, Ama-Olofisto, Amachikane, and Amatileane. These crews were usually defined by which area of the township they came from and were usually at war with others from the other parts of the townships. Consequently, they limit their freedom of movement and those of the other youth. Something I also found interesting with this whole Quran thing was also how some of these young men were adopting gang names from American gangs. As you can tell, you can hear names like Amavato and things like that, which is more the, I think, Latin American Vatos Locos and things like that. So a lot of the culture is also informed by what we see on the TV, which is also something that I found interesting. And especially where they also had identifying clothes. So if you were in a certain township, you weren't allowed to be seen with a black K-way jacket or something like that. And if you went to like certain things, and they all had different markers. So they had expensive shoes. So if this crew wore Cavelas, this crew wore the All-Stars, etc., etc. So all of these interactions were also intersecting in terms of different classes, because this Cavela crew was seen as better than the crew that were All-Stars, etc., etc. This pattern aligns with broader scholarship on territory, which SAC defines as the attempt by individuals or groups to influence or control people, relationships, and resources by asserting authority over a specific geographic area. In Langa, as in neighboring townships such as Khayelitsha, territory shaped how young men interpret threat, loyalty, and belonging. Participants described strong attachment to the immediate locations and heightened provocativeness over these spaces, suggesting that place served as a central marker of identity and social recognition. Kornblatt argues that our circumstances, including the environments we inhabit, shape how we understand ourselves, while Jenkins highlights identity as a relational process grounded in how individuals see themselves and how they are seen by others. The data from this study reflects these dynamics, showing that locality was not simply a physical space, but a key dimension of how young men in Langa navigated conflict, safety, and personhood. Understanding these origins provides the foundation for examining how masculinity, group identity, and survival shape participants in Ikurans. A constant theme across interviews was the role of masculinity in shaping participation in Ikurans. Violence was described as a public performance, which boys earned visibility, respect, and legitimacy. As Bokele, one of my participants, reflected, I still have a lot of friends of mine that they were smoking drugs back then, you know. Like I was hanging out with the older kids, you know, like I was probably around 13 and the oldest would be like 17. You'd be like 17, on with a big kid would be 17, children's. Also the way they spoke was very also, he said this shows how scared they were at the time. Like, you know, I do experiment with marijuana, like now and then. But when I was 13, the mad things that were happening in front of me, I'm just like, even if I remember the first time I saw someone smoking crystal meth, I was like, I have to go home, man. Yeah, I think I gotta go home right now. Like from back then, you knew that's how they can branch into criminality and stuff like that. You know, I also think it's important for survival purposes to be part of something, you know. I don't want to call it a name because you see, it's kind of like your own community that gets affected. The interviews suggest that masculinity played a central role in shaping how young men understood and participated in ignorance. Participants framed violence not simply as aggression, but as a public performance through which boys established credibility, toughness, and social relevance. Scholarship on performative masculinities helps make sense of this dynamic, as it emphasizes that manhood is often expressed and validated through embodied acts that signal fearlessness and readiness to confront danger. In Langa, the pressures of the territorial conflict, peer scrutiny, and limited avenues for recognition heighten the importance of these performances. This study shows how young men navigated the emotional demands of this context and how participation in ignorance became tied to a sense of identity, belonging, and survival. Participation also produced a form of identity lock-in once a young man was known as capable of violence. Withdrawing from these practices risked exclusion, ridicule, or retaliation, echoing Radele's analysis of how embodied masculinities are produced within structural marginalization. My next finding is titled which is based off of my findings off of how young men spoke about their experiences of having attended initiation school. Now, initiation school is very important for young Xhosa men as it's called going to the mountain and it's a rite of passage. Usually young men go between the ages of 17 to about 20 years old, but it's a big culture within the Eastern Cape and some areas here of the Western Cape, and especially in the Black communities. This was very important for the study because some of the young men, when speaking about what brought on some of the changes they experienced, some who were participants who targeted others of violence, some who were victims of violence. A lot of the young men spoke about how this undergoing initiation school helped solve some of the issues which were going on in the community. And especially because now, after you undergo this initiation, you are seen as a man and you're supposed to contribute positively to the community, as you'll hear with some of the experiences shared by the participants. But I wanted to especially highlight the saying that says, because it's a closer saying, which kind of highlights that a key marker for someone's manhood is how they act. And this became important in this idea of this performative masculinity, which I was seeing as a form of violence that was being expressed through violence. So some of these young men spoke about alternative forms of how they would then take on these masculine performances. Some of them spoke about how they were raised by some of the other old men in the community. So by the time, like not having a father at home. So by the time they had to go to initiation school, they were helped out by these older men who would go see them while they were at the bush, or bring them food, etc., etc. And they spoke about how all of these things then informed their ideas of what would it look like if they had a positive impact in the community. Some spoke about fatherhood, some spoke about having found work, some even spoke about their mothers and how seeing some of the trauma their mothers went through, it's watching some of the violence that were going on in the township because of ignorance. Some of them, in my extended version, some of the parents spoke about how they wouldn't even allow their kids to go to the shops and how people had to go straight from home. Well, I mean, for example, one of the kids was a soccer store in the township and he wouldn't be allowed because of this violence that's going on. And he in fact, is one of the kids that ended up being paralyzed from the violence. So some of these experiences and how they made sense of this stuff was very difficult, and especially in the township sense. And especially when you think about having the, how do you go to initiation school when you're paralyzed? What does that mean for your manhood, etc., etc. So when speaking about the initiation process, Malusi said he was first exposed to ubungalati as a young boy when his older brother went to the mountain. This theme first emerged when I asked Malusi what has shaped his understanding of what it means to be a man. He said, I think I've always looked up to my dad and my two older brothers to get an understanding of what it means to be a man. My brother went to initiation school and I was excited to be in Ngalati Lake. Now, Ngalati is a young boy that stays around the initiation school to kind of help out if they need anything, if they need food, if they need water, they bring all of the stuff. But this is a way that I argued in this paper that this is a way that some of the young men are introduced to these masculine ideas because they sleep there, they spend the whole 3 weeks there as you're also there, and they get to catch some of the things that are happening there, some of the conversations that happen there, ideas around what it means to be a man, some of the good things, some of the bad things. Because I mean, at the same time in these initiation schools, some of them they smoke alcohol, they drink alcohol, they have drugs there, etc., etc. So some of these influences can be both negative and positive for these young men. I had a great time that December because I was close to my brother, even though he was much older. Ukanke Wake, who is an elder who takes care of the initiation during the process, was also a cousin of ours. So I was really not scared. But I think sleeping inside Iboma, which is the hut that they sleep in, and having to be there all the time is the toughest part. It taught me a lot about Ukwaluta though, because there were a lot of initiates where my brother went to the bush. They always used to come together during the day, and I would just sit and listen to what they were being told. It was also scary though, because I saw a lot of bad things at a young age. It's like some of Amakangata, who are the guys that look after the kids, abusing or hitting some of the Abapeta, which is what they call initiates when they go in, if they did not listen to the instructions. And sometimes they would tell the others to discipline the initiate for not listening by striking him 3 times with the stick. Here, Molusi talks about what he had learned during his time of being in Ngad and seeing how these things were done to initiates. Molusi introduced the topic of initiates experiencing violence during this process and suggested that there were ways to discipline the initiates if they didn't listen. Here, I believe that we see that it is also possible that the violence that men use against each other plays an important role in the construction of difference among men. An initiate must know his place, and thus violence must be used to show it to him. Van der Merwe, in his article titled Violence as a Form of Communication, essentially argued that violence and negotiations are 2 ends of the same continuum of communication. They are both intended to convey a message. People resort to physical violence, especially when they look for other avenues for communicating their message when they have been blocked. In our one-on-one interview, Musana spoke very well to how he understands manhood as a disabled man in the township. Musana said, being a man was taught to me by my father. He has always been very supportive of us as his kids and would travel with me to take me to soccer games before I was paralyzed. Even after my accident, when I joined the wheelchair basketball team, he supported me and took me to games. Even though he was very disappointed after my accident, he was able to support me and show me love, which I really appreciated. Even the other guys who are my age tried to involve me in things that we do as young men, like attending immigrant or supporting other ceremonies that other men in the communities have to attend. It is difficult because I can't always go because of these things are not usually wheelchair friendly. It isn't easy, but I have to fight to show that I deserve to be seen as a man too. Law 2023, whose work is titled Every Slap Demeans Me, at the intersection of disability, masculinity, and intimate partner violence in the Global South, found that societal expectations and participants' explorations around masculinity impacted the vulnerability to violence. In the study, they examined narratives of working-class colored men with spinal cord injuries in Cape Town who argued because of their disability, they fell victim to intimate partner violence. Here, Lusana speaks about what he sees as his precarious position as a man. Participants of their study reported experiences of disrespect and social exclusion in their communities and felt incapable of protecting themselves when being violated. Here, Lusanda speaks about what he sees as this precarious position as a man who is disabled. He often receives disrespect from young guys who don't know him. He says he has to fight for his position as a man in the community by being visible at community gatherings and being able to attend and engage. This is also an example of the contested nature of masculinity in the Black township, as Lusana speaks to the idea of the younger guys not knowing him and thus not respecting and disrespecting him, which he also ties to his disability. However, I believe that it is important that he spoke of the alternative ways which he views as for him fighting for his position as a man in the community. These are important as I believe they are less harmful and also present an opportunity for these men to make constructive contributions towards the upliftment of their community, which I view as being essential for positive constructions of human masculinity. However, Molusu goes on to add that there are various ways to achieve masculine status. However, he argues that this status does not grant you hegemonic masculinity in the township, as this status is always contested because there are other men who have access to similar positions. Malusi said, but brah, here everyone tends to respect each other because we know that all these things really don't matter. In isiXhosa, we say "Indoda ngezenzo," which is a Xhosa saying which means you can see a man by the way he acts. So respect you for how you behave and how you carry yourself. All these things about violence and money don't really matter because there will always be someone who can fight better or have more money or even have a prettier girlfriend. So for us, it's your actions that we respect. The idea of Indoda ngezenzo is a very central theme in my study, as it rests on a traditional idea where men are seen as providers or breadwinners that can make things happen to support their family. Although this is an old Xhosa saying, it is one that features heavily in how Xhosa men understand masculinity. This can be seen in how participants state this, but I also know this to be true from my own experiences of being a Xhosa man. The reason that this is so important is that it moves beyond the masculine status which can be earned through performances, but rather rests on more tangible ideas like being able to provide for your family or raising your children well. The meaning that participants convey here is that a man should act more than he talks. This conversation about how to gain a masculine status had also come up in a one-on-one interview I did with Mongezi, who was a participant in my second group interview. I had initially asked the group what some of the things they look up to in the older guys in the community. He argued that we all know that to be a man, one must go to the bush, which is another way for initiation school. But for me, I grew up without a father, so I know what it looks like to others to teach I grew up without a father, so I know what it's like to look to others to teach you how to be a man. For me, I always looked up to my uncle, because even though he didn't have a job, he always made sure his family had everything they needed. He wasn't really a wealthy guy, but for me, he taught me what a man is supposed to be. In this extract, we can see ideas of manhood being shaped by the support of those around a young black man. Mongezi speaks to the idea of what he saw in his community and the men around him, and how they shaped his understanding of masculinity. This not only speaks to the social construction of masculinity, but also how one's community can impact how they choose to navigate manhood. The importance of community is something that Makiwane and colleagues in 2017 found in their work on the changing family structure. In their work, they found that as opposed to extended family being seen as a resource to draw on, more frequently, neighbors were cited as people who could be approached in times of distress for assistance. They argued that the neighbors' proximity meant that they would understand the situation well, and people would be in a position to help their neighbors in a similar situation, as reciprocity was highly valued. This coping mechanism reveals that with people's geographic spread, the family is not necessarily the immediate social safety net. Okay. This coping mechanism reveals that with people's geographic spread, the family is not necessarily the immediate social safety net any longer, but rather those who are accessible as the first point of call. Mongezi, who was also in the second group interviews, expressed that another issue is that initiates were exposed to mistreatment at the hands of amakangata, who are often also drinkers, and then they are unable to teach the initiates things of value. Mongezi said, another thing is amakangata. Some families just take anyone, then they drink while they are supposed to be washing the initiates. When they are drunk, they sleep or they treat the initiates badly, and even sometimes abuse them. I think as a result, this has made some who undergo the initiation to not see the value in it and never want to do anything with it again. That is sad because it is so important for us as Xhosa people, but instead people treat it with a lack of respect. In this extract, Mongezi speaks to the challenges that some of the young men face while undergoing initiation. He mentions how some families do not make the right choices when looking for a makangata, which ends up affecting the young boys who are initiated. He mentions that this is made worse by the fact that sometimes amakangata drink and then they treat initiates badly. This largely goes unreported as there is an element of secrecy that surrounds initiation in schools. So these amakangata often continue with the terrible treatment of initiates. Mongezi then mentions how this is why so many people have lost respect for the initiation school, noting that bad experiences often make young men lose the value they once saw in undergoing initiation. And for my final findings section, this is one that was focused more on the school violence. As much as the Quran spoke towards this idea of school violence, I thought that some of the experiences were very different. And it was more important to highlight specifically some of the experiences that some of the young men had. And especially because, again, some of these young men, some who went to schools in other townships and they had relationships or crews formed because of these interactions they had, because they had to travel between the different townships. Some told stories of how their involvement, their actual involvement in these wars, these performances that they did. One boy told the story of how he actually went to another friend's school to stab someone else, or did something else to a friend. So this also just showed how real the violence was. I think a lot of the time when they were speaking about it, they tried to distance themselves from some of the actual violent acts, or more likely portray themselves as the victims. So tell the stories where they were victims of the violence and the perpetrators. But I feel like in this conversation around what happened during the school hours was also quite different, because they were then, the tough act wasn't there anymore. They were more open, and they were more, the secrecy. I feel like most of the time, by the time we had gotten to this point of the interviews, they had been more free to communicate more freely, had a better understanding of what exactly I was looking at in terms of the violence, and thus they were more free in terms of being able to communicate some of their direct experiences and some of their own involvement, as you'll hear. So this section explores the accounts of participants who have experienced also. This section explores the accounts of participants who have experienced violence within the premises of their schools, and how, having experienced this violence, shape their understanding of school as a learning space. This study seeks to locate schools within the literature which indicates how important schools are for the development of young children, especially within their adolescent and teen years. Of the 10 participants of my study, 4 of the participants had attended high schools within the Langa township, 3 of my participants had attended high schools in the neighboring townships, and 3 of the participants had attended schools in the Cape Town city. In South Africa, schools in disadvantaged areas such as township suffer from serious problems of unsafe learning environments. Learners' experiences of being violently victimized in South African schools has become a more feature of everyday life, particularly in the township setting. While this is but one reason for school violence, especially within township schools, it remains a reality. Township schools are especially vulnerable to unsafe conditions and threats of violence due to, among other things, poor resources and infrastructure and their location, especially in and around informal settlements. In one of the group interviews I had done, Avela, who was part of group 1 and had said to have attended a high school in the township, shared a story where he had been the target of a fight during school, and how this fight led to him to be more aware of his possible dangers at the school. He said, during a school break, this one time I had gotten into an argument with this one guy who stayed in a different part of the township over a joke I made in class. I thought it was over after break, but as we entered the classroom, he attacked me from behind and started hitting me. He had 2 friends with him who would stop anyone from stopping the attack. As I tried to fight, the 2 teachers entered the classroom and separated us. Avela would later on to go to state that after that fight, I knew I had to make sure that I'm not too far away from my friends, because in that situation, they would have been able to help me. The analysis of the study so far has shown that masculine identity in South Africa intersects with many other identity markers, corresponding especially with the institutions of patriarchy, violence, and space. Therefore, to understand how these experiences figure in the broader practices of masculinity and genders, men's violence has been described as a gendered practice whereby men accomplish or do gender. So, for example, we see in the experience shaped by Avela above, men then try to reassert their masculine identity through other ways. Here, Avela does so by remaining close to how friends or to his friends, to remain close to his friends, where he feels his masculine position is safe and they will presumably help him should he face any more violent threats. Similarly, Melusi, with whom I had done a one-on-one interview, shared a story where he felt like in his school in Kubuletu, which is another township here in the Western Cape, he had to be smart and reserved to navigate the environment, as he felt that the boys at his school were often dangerous by the way they always picked fight with those they saw as outsiders. Patriarchal ideas are often at the root of men's perpetration of bullying. For example, in a 2017 study in the US, young men who held the most inequitable gender attitudes were significantly more likely to report both perpetrating and experiencing verbal, online, and physical bullying. Research suggests that bullying behaviors often share common root causes: the perpetrator's desire to demonstrate power and control over the victim, and the use of bullying to enforce gender conformity. Additionally, bullying can provide a pathway to achieve or maintain a social status within group settings, such as schools and workplaces. Looking at these violent attacks experienced at schools as bullying might be useful in that it highlights a powerful dynamic that exists among the boys who fight, whether it be based off of the space, respect, dominance or even as gender as a performance to assert one's manhood in the township. These violent attacks perpetrated by these young men are often planned with known targets. Thus, this presents a configuration of masculinity in which these young men must live in constant fear of being attacked.
I wonder if we can just use the last few minutes in case someone has a burning question.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, thanks, Bapiwe.
Thank you very much.
I know it's no easy feat to synthesize an entire PhD. So I'm just we've got like literally about three minutes or so, but what I'm gonna just start by saying is, if anybody does have any burning questions at home or in person, I'm sure that you will be happy to discuss with them by email.
Yes.
But for now, if anyone at home wants to ask something, you're welcome to put up your hand or type it in the chats and I will read it to Bapiwe. And then in person, I'm going to open up to now if anybody has anything to ask him. Or we'll close the conversation.
I found it quite fascinating hearing the story that you were receiving from your participants. I'm wondering how did you find interviewing them and getting these stories from them? How did that experience go?
Thank you for that. To actually find participants wasn't that easy because of I have family roots in the Langa township for family being there from there previously, but I don't know anyone there currently. So what had helped was some colleagues at my center who were from there, who knew people from there, and they shared my advertisements around. And I was lucky enough to meet a priest who was also willing to introduce me to his congregation or whatever. And through that, then I met the young men. At first, it was difficult because everyone had this question of what exactly are you looking at? So that made it a bit more difficult in terms of refining the communication, because they also don't want to tell this, again, they don't want to tell the stories of them being perpetrators. So it was mostly about the violence they experienced. And my question was more about this binary of being a victim and a perpetrator and how the system goes on. But in terms of the actual interviews, once we got to be more comfortable with each other, in fact, I had one of the young guys who I did an interview with who helped me get other participants after our interview. And in fact, even with my research methodology, I had initially planned to do one-on-one interviews until I had a group of 5 guys who said no, they prefer to do it together because we were in the same group. So around this time, there was obviously questions around ethics and stuff like that. But after having this conversation with my supervisors and everything, it became better. And I ended up doing another group interview because of this. So they're a lot free, and especially in terms of when the group interviews, I think some of the stories they told, not that they were proud, but they were reminiscing of their friends and everything. So it was fun for them in that sense. But I do think that a lot of them they don't realize realistically how dangerous some of the things that they participated in. I mean, one of the guys tells a story about how he was with a friend and they were going somewhere and they get chased by this guy who's trying to rob them. And the friend gets stabbed and the friend kind of convinces him to go on without him and to try and get help. And even when he's telling the story, he doesn't realize that his friend could have lost his life because his friend was badly stabbed. He was just lucky that they entered a house that was close by that they knew. So some of these, they weren't really aware of some of the dangers and like critically thinking about some of these things. But what I did find was some of the older guys did reflect more honestly on understanding how dangerous some of this was, and also the dissatisfaction with some of the things playing out or play out even now with how some of the other guys are still gangsters, etc., etc. So some of them are aware, but I just think it has a lot to do with also the age, how much they've come to terms with it. But also then I think it also had a lot to do with how they view things. For example, like if they look on it with pride, if they look at it with shame, if they're embarrassed, etc., etc. But overall, I think the interviews went really well. And for the most part, especially within the community, because some of the guys, like these pictures, one of the other guys asked me to go around the township and take pictures because he had this thing that people always come to do interview, like research in the township, but no one really understands what exactly the lived experience is of someone being there. So even when I was there, they asked me if I don't want to go around the township, just to show me around and stuff like that, which I really appreciated because even one of the other young men has an NGO which is where this topic of initiation came out. He says with his NGO, they like they go, because people go in June or December. So he gathers the young men in the township and then they go to see these other young men in the bush and stuff like that. So that's where these kind of topics came up and these conversations. It's like it was just general conversation. So sometimes we'd be at a corner and someone comes up and they have a chat and they say something important that I really feel like maybe I need to write down or note because it spoke to some of the questions that I had. So,
I think it's so interesting what you're saying, Bapiwe, because what you're really saying is that how we interpret experience is context dependent.
Mhm.
So, you know, the people who you were interviewing, their definition of violence and what constitutes a violent act, and the kinds, and when one is in danger and when one is not, is all shaped by the environment in which that experience exists. Because we can stand from the outside and say, oh, that's a really dangerous thing that you participated in. But within that particular context, people make different decisions about what really is they make different decisions about the actions that they participate in. Because we respond depending on what's demanded of us from our environment to survive in the environment. You know, like it was said earlier on, is this shifting between these binary positions of victim, perpetrator. So I think it's really fascinating how that is reflected in the paper.
no, thank you very much, Prof.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm also sorry for, I feel like again, there was a lot of information and I wasn't really sure what I should add, what I shouldn't. So I really hope that you enjoyed the presentation.
I found it interesting because I also think what you're sharing is so reflective of other spaces. Like we tend to think that experiences across different spaces are so different. But when you were talking, I think it was the first theme, Igunia, or I can't remember.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah. It made me think about the area that I grew up in when I was a child and how you would have all these groups of young men sitting on street corners.
No,
So these patterns of organization, they actually exist across different settlements.
Yeah, and it's only when we study
Yeah.
we learn about it. Which brings me, I'm going to sneak in a quick question, even though we could have time. But in your reflections as a qualitative researcher, can you give us a little bit of a sneak peek into what led you into this research in the first place?
so like I was saying earlier, it was the experience with my cousin at the time. But more than anything, I think generally speaking, like you were saying, when we come from like certain environments and stuff, we generally see a lot of violence. And I think being in spaces like Stellenbosch, etc., you realize how critical people are of certain experiences that we see as normal. So, because for example, if a prophet saying, I have a similar experience, because when I found out about what these things about the Qurans and stuff, it was similar to what happened going on in the Eastern Cape at home. The young men, we were not allowed to code the side, etc., etc. So it's very fascinating for me because I always view academia, the way that we approach academia, to not be aware of that people know these things. Like we always come in with coming with some great insight or whatever. But the reality is that when people live these day-to-day experiences and they see them on a day-to-day basis, they don't think of them as deeply as we think we're thinking about them. But when they experience them on the day, they don't use the theoretical frameworks or whatever, but they deal with these things on an everyday level. And that was my question, like how do we ask something that's not just going to be great academically for the questions and things like that, but something that actually speaks to the level of reality of something that I experience on a day to day. Because even when you go home to, it's something you can't avoid. Like when prophets say, when you go home, you can't avoid these experiences. Like you talk to other guys, like guys that I went to high school with now, and some of them are sitting in these street corners sharing things like, oh, well, I just got back from prison, etc., etc. So you ask yourself what exactly, and again with what you're saying, Prof, about how we come in these ideas that being so critical or whatever, but what about the people that live in these experiences on a day-to-day basis? And how do they make sense of it? Because that was the main question I had, was how do these people view these experiences that they have on a day-to-day basis?
Thanks, Bapiwe. I'm going to end off with the comments online, which just say excellent work. And then Prof. Kruger says, very interesting presentation. It's a real qualitative work.
Yeah.
So much attention paid to subtleties and nuances of the interview data.
Yes.
So you're definitely able to communicate that in the little bit of time.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I thought your work is beautiful. It's beautifully written as well. It's beautifully presented. It's very thoughtful.
Thank you.
So I completely resonate with Emily's comment.
I appreciate that comment. Actually, I don't think you remember, Prof. You said on my first ethics book, I think it was. So I really appreciate you saying that because that was really bad. Thank you very
Not
much.
as you imagine. Okay, thank you, everyone.
I remember even then thinking what a wonderful study this was going to make.
No, I